Okay, let's conduct a scientific or a sociological experiment. So as we said before, we're going to start with a hypothesis. So our hypothesis in this case is going to be, we're going to talk about the group of people that we're going to study as our sample. In this case, I'm going to talk about something kind of that I'm very familiar with. Prior to coming to HAC, I was working in the field of mental health and criminal justice. I was doing mental health therapy with people who were convicted of having committed sexual offenses. So we're going to use the topic of sex offenders. So if you're looking at our stages or steps in conducting research, our topic is sex offenders. Clearly the hypothesis we're going to use is the idea that sex offenders who engage in cognitive behavioral therapy will reduce their likelihood of reoffending again. So our hypothesis is our educated guess or our statement about what we expect to see happen, and it also includes descriptions of what our independent and dependent variables are. Okay, so if you remember the earlier discussion, the independent variables are what we're going to introduce to the experiment to cause change. Dependent variables are what we expect to see change. So in our hypothesis, we talked about offenders who successfully engage in treatment. That is our independent variable in this case, and the abbreviation we'll use for that is treatment, TX. And then we want to see if they'll do it again, and we use the term recidivism to describe committing a crime again. So that is the dependent variable. So our hypothesis contains both those elements. All right, so where do we start? Well, we need to find a group of people to study. That is going to be, as I said, our population, or in other words, our sample. So where are we going to find a bunch of sex offenders to study? Well, clearly most people would probably say prison, and that's a perfectly reasonable answer. Many studies have been done on offenders in a prison or incarcerated setting. However, in this case, I'm going to switch it up a little bit because we want to also study what happens when people get out of jail. So we want to study them in a non-prison environment. We want to see what their behavior in the community is going to be in this particular example of research. So I'm going to need to try to find offenders, and again, I've had students suggest that we could find them on things like Megan's Law, but again, you know, Megan's Law websites, which certainly you could do, that'll give you the information about who's been convicted. It doesn't necessarily guarantee if you go to their house, like in a survey kind of situation, that they're going to want to participate. We're going to need to want you know, a level of compliance that we can measure. So typically what usually happens is somebody suggests, and they're usually right, that we can go to probation and parole within a particular city or county, municipality. Those people who are usually released from prison are usually under conditions of supervision for a period of time where they have to do what their parole officers tell them to. So we could approach the parole office and say, hey, we'd like to do, I'm a therapist from, or I'm sorry, a researcher from HAC, and I'd like to do some research regarding offenders and recidivism, and assuming that they, you know, are impressed by my credentials and the study outline that I present them, they're going to, of course, say yes. So in this case, we're going to say that we went to a probation and parole officer office, said to them, we want to do this research. They agreed, and it just so happened, and we're very lucky, they have exactly 100 offenders on probation at the time. Fantastic. Nice round figure. Never is that easy, but again, simplicity's sake, for the purposes of this example, we use nice round numbers, okay? So they have exactly 100 offenders who are on probation. We get their consent to participate, and we explain everything that's going to happen, and then we decide, okay, we need to divide them up into two groups, an experimental group and a control group, okay? The experimental group is the group, as we see here, that will be exposed to our independent variable, which we've already listed as going to be treatment. So in other words, out of this sample, some of the offenders who are on probation and parole are going to participate in treatment, and then others are not. There are control groups, so you see the absence of the independent variable. Okay, so the easiest thing, obviously, with 100 people is divide them up 50-50. But then here is introduced another very important rule, is how do we decide who goes into what group? Right? The answer is that this division of the sample into treatment groups has to be, and demonstratedly be, random. Okay, we have to be able to describe how we randomly assign people to these two treatment groups. Okay, the obvious reason being that if we do not assign them randomly, then we leave ourselves open to criticisms that we are somehow being biased. I'll give you an example. If you remember, we talked about literature review. So in all the review we did of all the literature about offenders in preparing for this, one of the things we found out is there's actually different rates based on other studies that other people have done of recidivism among different types of offenders. So that we could have rapists, we could have child molesters, we could have people who expose themselves. And it's that population in particular, we learned from our reading that people who expose themselves tend to recidivate at a much higher rate based on the studies that other people did. So knowing that, I might be tempted to say to myself, well, I don't want those people in my experimental group, so I'm going to put them all in my control group. Well, as soon as I've done that, I have introduced bias into my research. I have now said, I've now effectively influenced the outcome. Okay? So we have to be able to demonstrate complete random sampling. So whether or not that is some kind of computer-generated thing that pulls names off a list, or names out of a hat, or the ping pong balls in the lotto machine, whatever else it is, we have to be able to demonstrate that we took those 100 people and randomly assigned them to one of these two groups. Okay, so now we need to get into some more specifics about what our independent variable is going to be. We said it is going to be treatment. Of course, in the abstract or the description of our treatment, we would have gone into much more detail about exactly what treatment entails. For all intents and purposes, again, so we've taken 50 people and we're going to put them in the experimental group, and we're going to put 50 people in our control group. And we're going to define treatment, let's say, as being cognitive behavioral therapy, which is a type of therapy, treatment. And the people who are in the experimental group will have to go once a week, and we're going to run our experiment for 2 years. All right? So once a week, everybody in the experimental group has to go to a cognitive behavioral therapy session, okay, conducted obviously by a professional within the field who's using standard practices and all that other kind of stuff. And then the people in our control group don't have to go. Okay? They still have to behave as if they're on probation and parole. They still have to follow the conditions of probation and parole. They still have to report to a probation officer. They may have to submit to things like random drug testing or polygraphs or house searches and all the other kind of things that the people in the experimental group do as well, but they are not required to go to treatment. All right? And as we said, we're going to run our experiment for 2 years. So at the end of 2 years, we're going to test our dependent variable. Okay, that is recidivism. Well, how are we going to know who reoffended and who didn't? Well, the assumption we're going to have to make here, and people have often mentioned things like polygraphs and things like that, I'm going to simplify the whole thing and say that we're just going to assume we're only going to count people who have been rearrested for another sex crime as having counted as having recidivated. Okay, so we're going to exclude other types of behaviors. They can't get arrested for shoplifting, jaywalking, and DUI, or anything like that. We're going to say it has to be a rearrest for another specific or another sex offense, okay, which is, we'll get into this topic in a later module, but that's something called specific recidivism as opposed to general recidivism, which is just breaking any rule or any law. Okay? So let's assume, our independent variable to test recidivism is going to be rearrest. Okay? Who got rearrested for another sexual offense? Let's assume, and I'll give you one example, that at the end of this 2 years, 20 of the offenders in the experimental group got rearrested during those 2 years for another sexual offense, and 40 got rearrested in our control group. Okay? Now again, that's data collection. During those 2 years, we have access through public records as well as the probation office who got rearrested for what. And so at the end now we're at analyzing the results. So at the end of 2 years, 20 out of 50, or 2 out of 5 rearrested. That is a reoffense rate of 0.4. Okay? Very easy math. Again, I'm oversimplifying this. And 4 out of 5 offenders rearrested as the control group gives us a reoffense rate of 0.8. Okay? At the end of our study, what do we know? Does this support our hypothesis? The answer is yes. So those who participated in treatment reoffended at a rate of 0.4. Those who did not participate in treatment reoffended at a rate of 0.8. Okay? 0.4 is half of 0.8. Okay? So our hypothesis that engaging in treatment lowers recidivism appears to be true. It's supported by our research. In fact, overwhelmingly supported. We can conclude that the reoffense rate drops by 50% when people successfully engage in treatment. All right? Is that the way that it had to work out? Of course not. We could come up with some different numbers. Let's say, for example, that 25 offenders from our experimental group and 25 from the control group got rearrested. Obviously 25 out of 50 is half, so we'd be talking about a reoffense rate in each of these groups of 0.5. Does this support our hypothesis? No. Okay. The answer is our hypothesis said that the independent variable treatment would lower or affect the dependent variable recidivism, and when we looked at our numbers, we saw that people in the control group and the experimental group and control group reoffended at exactly the same rates. Okay? So this research does not support our hypothesis. Okay? Once again, does that mean that this is useless? No, we may have to now rethink maybe if we're going to continue on with the treatment or continue on with the experiment, we have to rethink perhaps the ways that we've done some of this. Do alterations need to be made? Do we need to start again? Can we continue the experiment? Perhaps by making some alterations to the independent variables. Maybe the treatment's not intense enough. We could do all sorts of different things to make adjustments as we're going, or like I said, the idea of restarting again. Let's use another possible outcome. Let's say, for example, that $30 offenders from the experimental group reoffend, and we'll go back and use the same number we just were. 25 reoffend from the control group. Again, 30 out of 50 is a rate of 0.6, whereas we have a rate of 0.5 down here. Okay? Could the experiment turn out this way? Of course it does. Of course it could. Does this support our hypothesis? Once again, no, it does not. But it points out something else. Just because our hypothesis is not supported, does this necessarily mean that our research is useless, invalid? Okay, we are the people doing the research failures in some way. We should give it all up, right? Go home, get a new job, search the want ads. No. Okay. What this indicates to us is perhaps that treatment not only does not, in the second example I just gave you, not only not have an effect, but technically it appears that perhaps those offenders engaging in treatment are at a higher risk to reoffend. Why could that be? We may have to go back and rethink. You can make the case for the idea of, okay, if putting a bunch of sex offenders in a room with each other week after week after week, perhaps a dangerous thing to do. Could it be reinforcing some of their arousal patterns or their deviant thoughts? Or could they, in fact, perhaps maybe even be reinforcing each other's behavior? Whereas the control group reoffended at a significantly high rate, probably much higher than we'd like to, but lower than the ones going to treatment together. Okay? If I was the probation office at the end of the 2 years and saw those numbers, I may think to myself, I think we need to stop the treatment program, or we're certainly never going to engage one if we don't have one going, because it certainly seems that it's more dangerous putting these guys in a room together with each other. Okay? Now, rest easy. The actual statistics nationwide are much more like the ones I showed you at the very beginning, in case you're wondering, that the evidence and the research from, again, dozens, if not hundreds of studies have absolutely overwhelmingly concluded that research does have a positive effect of lowering recidivism. So once again, the most important things to this are the idea of how our hypothesis defines our independent and dependent variables, how we arrive at a sample, and how that sample is randomly assigned to an experimental and control group, and then how the data is collected and analyzed.